Were the titans who built modern America saints or sinners. The names themselves, they conjure up this image, almost like a caricature.
Oh, yeah. Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, Carnegie.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're talking about the 19th century industrial giants, the men we always associate with the Gilded Age.
And for generations, the story has been that they were robber barons.
Right. Ruthless villains who crushed the little guy, exploited labor, and basically manipulated the whole system just for personal gain.
But what if that whole narrative, that sort of progressive era wisdom that we've all been taught, is just fundamentally backward?
And that is the core question that's going to drive this entire deep dive.
It is. Our source material today is historian Burton Folsom Jr.'s incredible work, The Myth of the Robber Barons.
And he doesn't just challenge the story, does he? He really takes it apart piece by piece.
Meticulously.
Yeah.
He dismantles it, arguing that, success in the late 1800s didn't automatically mean you were a predator or corrupt.
So our mission here is to really unpack Folsom's most important insights.
And to separate genuine, market innovation from just simple government coercion.
It's such an essential distinction to make because when you think about the late 1800s, the economic growth was almost unprecedented.
Explosive.
You have railroads connecting to the coast, steel building our cities, oil lighting up our homes.
And the critics, their argument was that the captains of industry, as they were sometimes called, got rich by being parasites.
That these huge fortunes were built on the backs of exploited workers and crushed competition. They were framed as, enemies of the public good.
Exactly. And Folsom's central thesis just cuts right through all that fog. It cuts through the moralizing by introducing a really powerful and I think essential metric. He doesn't judge their personalities, not really. He judges their methods. How did these men actually achieve their success?
And that leads him to define two very different types of entrepreneur.
Two completely different paths to success that were being taken in the Gilded Age.
Okay, so let's start with the heroes of Folsom's narrative. These are the market entrepreneurs, the builders.
Right. These are your figures like Cornelius Vanderbilt, James J. Hill, Charles Schwab, and yes, John D. Rockefeller.
And how did they succeed?
Through voluntary exchange, through intense competition, and just radical efficiency. Their whole game was predicated on cutting costs, innovating processes, and at the end of the day, serving the public with a product that was better and crucially cheaper.
They won by delivering value. And then you have the other side of that coin. The figures Folsom argues should probably carry that robber baron label. The political entrepreneurs.
The opportunists. The manipulator.
And their method was totally different.
Completely. These people succeeded not because of market genius, not by serving you, the consumer, but by exploiting government privilege.
So lobbying.
Aggressive lobbying. For massive government subsidies, for protective tariffs, exclusive contracts, any special favor they could get. They weren't trying to compete, they were trying to rig the game.
Which means their profits came at the expense of the taxpayer and the consumer.
Right, because they were insulated from the need to be efficient by all that political protection.
So if you're listening, the core question for you is this. Which of these two groups actually spurred real sustainable economic growth?
And which group permanently drove down prices, making life demonstrably better for the average American family?
We're going to find out. We're going to look at case studies straight from Folsom's work, starting right where the action began. The steamship industry and the rise of the Commodore. Okay, so our journey starts on the water with a figure everyone learns about in school, Robert Fulton.
The pioneer of American steamboating.
But Folsom doesn't just praise him as an innovator. He points out that Fulton immediately tried to use state power to his advantage.
That's exactly right. He was innovative, no doubt. But one of his first big moves was to secure a massive government privilege.
A monopoly.
A 30-year monopoly granted by the New York legislature to carry all steamboat traffic in New York waters.
And what does a lack of competition create?
Stagnation and incredibly high prices. To get from New York City to Albany by steamboat, you were paying a staggering $7 fare.
$7 back then. It's a huge amount of money.
It was a monumental cost for the average worker in the early 1800s. It was almost a week's wages for some.
So it made travel a luxury, not a tool for economic life.
Precisely. And this is where a young Cornelius Vanderbilt comes into the story. He's the market's answer to this state-backed stagnation.
He got almost no formal education, right?
None. But he was hired specifically to break that monopoly. He started running steamboats, charging way lower rates, basically daring the monopoly to stop him.
And this commercial warfare, it eventually goes all the way to the Supreme Court.
It does. In the 1824 landmark case, Gibbons v. Ogden, the court ruled against the New York state monopoly, saying the federal government had authority over interstate commerce. The monopoly was broken.
Okay, so what was the immediate tangible effect for the average person wanting to get to Albany?
Instantaneous and dramatic. The moment that monopoly was legally dead, the fares plummeted overnight.
From what to what?
From $7 down to $3. Just like that.
Wow.
And Fulton's politically connected group, they couldn't compete with the new market rates. They went bankrupt pretty quickly.
That's Folsom's first big lesson, isn't it?
Yeah.
The benefit of market freedom goes directly to the consumer immediately.
Yes. But Vanderbilt, he didn't stop at $3. His strategy is really the definition of a market entrepreneur.
He wasn't just looking for a decent profit.
No, he was looking for maximum efficiency, maximum volume, and just total dominance through being the cheapest. He was relentless.
He forced that New York to Albany fare down to $1.
Then to 10 cents. And famously, he even offered the trip for free.
Wait, free? How does that even work? Isn't that what people call predatory pricing, selling below cost to kill competition?
Well, Folsom argues it wasn't selling below cost. It was a completely different revenue model.
How so?
Vanderbilt covered his operating costs by turning the journey itself into an experience. He sold food, drinks, other things on board.
So he understood that if you lower the barrier to entry, the fare to zero, your volume goes through the roof.
Exactly. And then he could profit from all the ancillary sales. His competitors, still stuck in the old high fare model, they just couldn't wrap their heads around it.
He was basically thinking like a modern budget airline, but a century early.
A perfect analogy. His whole philosophy was brutally efficient. He actually said, if I could not run a steamship alongside of another man and do it as well as he for 20% less than it cost him, I would leave the ship.
He believed in winning purely on efficiency.
And the results were revolutionary. Harper's Weekly, which was no friend to the industrialists, they observed that wherever Vanderbilt set up a competing line, fares were instantly reduced.
And crucially, they stayed down.
Right. They wrote that however the contest terminated, the fares were never again raised to the old standards. His competition led to a permanent reduction of fares for the public.
Okay, now let's bring in the perfect contrast. The political entrepreneur on the Atlantic crossing route, Edward K. Collins.
Collins fought Vanderbilt head-to-head in the 1840s and 50s for that lucrative transatlantic trade. But he had zero interest in competing on efficiency.
His whole strategy was political.
Entirely. He appealed to Congress using these powerful arguments about American nationalism. He claimed the U.S. needed heavily subsidized steamships to compete with the British Cunard Line.
And he also argued they could double as a military fleet in case of war.
He wasn't appealing to the consumer. He was appealing to the state for protection and money.
And did he get it?
Oh, he was wildly successful at first. He lobbied Congress until they awarded him huge subsidies. It started at $385,000 a year, which was then almost immediately bumped up to a massive $858,000 a year.
That's guaranteed income no matter how badly you perform.
Right. And Vanderbilt, watching his competitor get these enormous handouts, he called it what it was. He said this federal aid was paralyzing private enterprise.
He saw how unfair and inefficient it was.
And he was right. Despite all that government money, Collins' ships, the Atlantic, the Pacific, they were notoriously expensive to build, poorly constructed, slow, and accident-prone. They needed days of costly repairs after every single trip because Collins had no market incentive to build them efficiently or robustly. It was, as Folsom argues, subsidized incompetence.
And the ultimate market critique came when Vanderbilt built his own unsubsidized ship.
The Vanderbilt, so powerful, so efficient, it won the coveted Blue Ribbon Award for the fastest trip from New York to Liverpool. It just completely eclipsed Collins's performance.
So the market reality of Vanderbilt's efficiency plus Collins's mismanagement.
And devastating accidents. He lost 2 ships. Nearly 500 people died. That finally soured Congress on the whole scheme.
So in 1858, they pulled the plug.
They revoked his aid. And what happened? Collins immediately filed for bankruptcy. Vanderbilt, the market entrepreneur, became the leading American steamship operator. Folsom holds this up as just a clear, definitive victory for efficiency over political favoritism.
This whole dynamic gets even more dramatic when we look at the California gold rush traffic. The political favoritism there was even more blatant.
Yeah, the U.S. Mail and Pacific Mail lines were operating with huge federal aid. Initially, they were charging an incredible $600 per passenger to get from New York to California.
$600. And that route was vital.
It was vital, and the price was astronomical because the subsidized lines had a near monopoly.
And Vanderbilt sees this price gouging as a market opportunity.
Of course. He builds a shorter route across Nicaragua and just starts dismantling their system. He offered to carry the U.S. mail for free, a direct challenge to the whole reason for the subsidy, and he slashed the passenger fare.
From $600 down to
$400, then quickly to just $150. And even at $150, Folsom points out, he and his competitors were still making money.
Which just shows you the insane profit margin the subsidized guys were enjoying.
It was pure rent-seeking. But instead of giving up, the political entrepreneurs fought back. They went straight back to Congress and lobbied to get their annual aid increased to $900,000.
And this is where we get to what Folsom calls the aha moment, the detail that just exposes the whole rotten system.
It is jaw-dropping. Vanderbilt, who was enraged by this new unfair government advantage, was eventually paid a staggering $672,000.
Which was 75% of the annual government subsidy.
To do what? To simply leave the route. To stop competing.
So Vanderbilt, the man who spent his life fighting subsidies, makes a fortune by taking a massive bribe from the subsidized companies to just go away.
Precisely. The subsidy was so enormous that the political entrepreneurs could afford to pay Vanderbilt almost 3/4 of it and still make a profit because the threat of his real competition was gone.
But even in defeat, the market entrepreneur wins for the consumer.
He does. Vanderbilt's temporary presence had reset the market. The original $600 monopoly fare was permanently slashed to $200 even after he took the payoff. The damage to the monopoly was done.
So the ultimate takeaway from this whole era is pretty stark. The money meant to promote American shipping ended up promoting incompetence.
It drove up costs, and it held back progress. The moment that subsidy was removed in 1858, the industry was forced closer to a free market, and operators had to win on service and price, not political connections.
Vanderbilt eventually sells his ships and moves into railroads, which brings us to the next great proving ground for Folsom's thesis.
Right. And if the steamship era showed subsidies as a curse, the Transcontinental Railroad era provides really definitive proof that they were a structural disaster.
The typical story is that these massive projects, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, couldn't have been built without huge government help.
That's the narrative. They were granted enormous amounts of land and cash, and they were paid per mile of track laid.
And that structure just seems designed to fail the consumer. It creates this perverse incentive system.
It absolutely does. The incentive isn't quality, it's speed and length. The goal for the UP and CP builders was to lay as many miles as possible, as fast as possible, to collect the most land and cash.
So they used cheap materials.
Cheap, light wrought iron rails that wore out quickly. They built tracks that deliberately wound around things just to add mileage. They used inferior wooden culverts instead of durable masonry, just rushing construction at every turn.
And this haste, this greed, driven by the political handouts, leads directly to one of the biggest scandals of the era.
It sure does. The infamous Credit Mobilier corruption scandal. UP officers basically set up their own construction company, wildly inflated the costs, and then bribed dozens of congressmen and officials to make sure the government kept paying.
And what about the Central Pacific?
Their leaders, the Big Four, they escaped jail not by proving their innocence, but reportedly by accidentally destroying all their financial records and using their political pull to avoid prosecution.
These were the quintessential political entrepreneurs.
Using the state to dominate, monopolize, and bribe.
And the inevitable end result of this government-aided, inefficient construction.
Financial collapse. The Union Pacific went bankrupt in 1893. And here's Folsom's critical point. The aid created inefficiency, bad tracks, high maintenance, which angered customers, which led to more government regulation, and that whole cycle just led straight to bankruptcy.
But what about the counter-argument? That the subsidy was worth it because it connected the country faster, that some waste was okay for that social good.
That's the strongest argument against Folsom, and he tackles it directly. He concedes that, okay, the increase in social return from getting the railroad built a little bit faster was temporary, but the high fixed costs and the structural inefficiency from that shoddy construction were permanent. The public had to suffer for decades with poor service, high prices, and high operational risk, all because the design prioritized political speed over engineering excellence.
So now let's introduce the counter-narrative. The greatest success story in railroading, James J. Hill.
The builder of the Great Northern, Hill is the ultimate market entrepreneur in this space.
Because he succeeded where all the subsidized roads failed.
He built the Great Northern from St. Paul to Seattle, across some of the harshest terrain in the country, without any federal aid whatsoever.
His whole approach was the polar opposite of his rivals.
Completely. He built slowly, methodically. He focused entirely on ruthless, long-term efficiency and quality.
He was obsessed with engineering to minimize his fixed costs.
That's the key. He chose the best grade, the least curvature, the shortest possible route to achieve the lowest long-term operating costs. Every percentage point of grade reduction meant exponentially less fuel and wear and tear over decades.
While the UP and CP were constantly paying for their initial haste.
Right. Through massive perpetual maintenance and fuel bills, Hill minimized those from day one.
And his market-driven approach gave him a crucial technological edge, too.
It did. Until Carnegie perfected American steel, European rails were generally better.
But the subsidized lines were trapped.
Their federal charters required them to buy American-made steel, even if it was inferior. Hill, operating on his own, was free to buy the superior English and German rails, which further increased his efficiency.
And Hill's philosophy wasn't just about transport, it was about regional development.
He was a true builder. He saw the railroad as a tool to promote exports, to develop the Northwest. He prospered with the region, not off it.
And the result of all this?
The Great Northern was the only transcontinental railroad that never went bankrupt.
That final scorecard, Hill's GN standing tall while all the subsidized roads collapsed, is Folsom's most powerful evidence.
It really is. But the great irony is that this incredible efficiency made Hill a target for regulators.
A real tragedy that Folsom highlights. The anti-monopoly laws that were supposedly designed to curb the corrupt guys, the UP builders.
They ended up hurting the most efficient, unsubsidized market builder the most.
Let's look at the Hepburn Act of 1906. It empowered the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC. It targeted rate discrimination, which sounds good on paper. Why did it hurt Hill so badly?
Because Hill's strategy was global. He was trying to develop the Northwest by offering critical rate discounts to his Asian shipping partners to capture huge export markets for American cotton and wheat.
It was smart pricing to beat international rivals.
Of course. But the Hepburn Act banned these very discounts. And the result was that American trade to those countries immediately dropped by 40%.
A massive blow to American farmers and exporters, all because regulators wanted rigid, uniform rates.
Hill even testified before the ICC. He argued that rates have to vary with competition and volume, but they ignored him. He was essentially forced to abandon the Asian trade. A regulation meant to ensure fairness at home ended up crippling one of America's best global competitors.
And then came the Sherman Antitrust Act.
This is where the legal precedent really turned against the efficient builder. Hill tried to consolidate his holdings into the Northern Securities Company for even greater efficiency.
But Teddy Roosevelt went after him.
He did. And in 1904, the Supreme Court ruled against him. Justice Harlan wrote this truly devastating line that the mere existence of such a combination constitutes a menace.
The mere existence, not its actions.
Right. Folsom argues this was profoundly damaging. It established that size alone, regardless of whether prices were falling or efficiency was increasing, could be deemed illegal. It created a climate where efficient companies were afraid to grow, afraid to innovate too much. The regulation that was meant to punish the politically connected ended up striking down a genuine, job-creating market builder.
Okay, moving from the rails to the steel that built them. We see the same pattern. Entrepreneurs succeeding through sheer technical merit, often outperforming the political structures meant to protect them. Let's start with the Scrantons.
The story of the Scrantons is really the story of American industrial independence. Before them, the U.S. was completely dependent on expensive, imported English iron for railroad rails.
So if England wanted to raise prices, they could halt American development.
They could. And the Scrantons succeeded despite not having a great location. They set up in the Lackawanna Valley, a wilderness at the time, with pretty poor local ores.
So their advantage wasn't natural resources.
It was ingenuity, the ability to bring together capital, talent, and management. They became the first Americans to successfully mass-produce high-quality iron rails. They literally built the entire city of Scranton, Pennsylvania, around their ironworks.
And their success created massive upward mobility.
Huge. It drew in thousands of immigrants and poor farmers who now had high-wage, reliable work.
What's really remarkable here, though, is the timing of their success, especially when it comes to tariffs. The conventional wisdom is that U.S. industry needed high tariffs to survive.
And Folsom uses the Scrantons to just blow that argument up. They succeeded during a period of very low tariffs, the Walker Tariff of 1846. George Scranton himself said publicly that they didn't need the tariff because their price was already competitive with the English product.
So the foundation of American heavy industry was earned in the open market, not behind a protectionist wall.
Exactly. And that sets the stage for the next generation, for guys like Charles Schwab, who came up through Andrew Carnegie's system.
And Schwab's career really underscores the power of market incentives and meritocracy.
Carnegie's system rewarded only two things: efficiency and innovation. His motto was simple: watch the costs and the profits will take care of themselves. Schwab just mastered cost-cutting.
Folsom has some great anecdotes about how Schwab motivated people.
The story of the Seconds rails is a perfect example. Schwab was put in charge of a mill that was making too many substandard rails.
Rails they couldn't sell at full price.
Right, so instead of just firing people, Schwab implemented a simple market-based incentive: cash bonuses to the workers who produced the fewest substandard rails that week.
And what happened?
Quality shot up immediately, and the increased profits from selling higher-grade product far exceeded the cost of the bonuses. It was an appeal to innovation, to ownership, to what Schwab called the American spirit of conquest.
Schwab later leaves U.S. Steel to run Bethlehem Steel, and that's where he makes his most famous market gamble, the gray beam.
This was a pivotal moment. J.P. Morgan's U.S. Steel had become conservative, resistant to big technological changes. Schwab, at Bethlehem, saw an opportunity. He defied all the experts and invested a shocking $5 million into this new gray beam technology. It allowed structural steel for skyscrapers to be made as a single, incredibly strong section. Before that, beams had to be riveted together, which was expensive and less efficient.
So Schwab's beam was cheaper and stronger.
It instantly captured the market from his conservative rival, U.S. Steel, and he financed it through market relationships, persuading his suppliers to give him credit based on his reputation, not on government favors.
He won on merit and salesmanship.
Aggressively. U.S. Steel eventually had to adopt the technology years later, but Schwab's Bethlehem had already permanently changed the industry.
But the ultimate proof of market superiority here comes from a spectacular government failure: the Folsom documents. Tell us about the federal armor plate plant.
This is a textbook case of political entrepreneurship gone wrong. In the early 1900s, critics were saying U.S. Steel and Bethlehem had a monopoly on armor plate for Navy ships, charging way too much. So the government decided to build its own factory.
They invested $17.5 million of taxpayer money. Did they successfully undercut the private monopolists?
Not even close. The federal plant, lacking all the incentives and efficiencies honed by market competition, produced goods at prices significantly higher than private industry.
Just as Schwab had warned them it would.
He told them it would waste taxpayer money because it would lack critical management. And he was right.
And how long did this federal plant last?
Within a year, it was shut down and put on inoperative status. It was never run again. A powerful, expensive monument to the futility of political solutions. When you remove the profit motive, incompetence is rewarded and the taxpayer gets the bill.
All right, if there's one figure who defines the Gilded Age robber baron stereotype above all others, it has to be John D. Rockefeller.
Oh, he's the poster child. The standard case study for predatory monopoly, thanks largely to critics like Ida Tarbell.
She accused him of getting rich solely off railroad rebates and crushing competitors.
Right. But Folsom's work paints him as the ultimate efficiency expert, driven by an almost moralistic passion for cutting costs.
So Folsom argues his success was rooted in eliminating waste in what was a really chaotic and dangerous early oil industry.
A meticulous, almost religious imperative to eliminate waste. When he and his partners founded Standard Oil, they were obsessed with precision, honesty, and quality control.
Give us some specifics. How did he get his costs so low?
Next level vertical integration. Take something as simple as the barrel. Coopers were charging $2.50 for a barrel to hold oil.
Okay.
Rockefeller hired chemists, bought his own timber tracks, built his own drying kilns and barrel-making machines, and slashed the cost of a single barrel down to just 96 cents. But he didn't stop there. Other refiners, they treated the byproducts of crude oil, the tar, the gasoline, as waste to be dumped in a river.
An environmental nightmare.
Rockefeller hired chemists to develop over 300 byproducts from that waste. Things like paraffin wax, Vaseline, lubricating oils. He maximized the value from every single barrel.
And this ruthless efficiency had a massive positive social impact.
It was revolutionary. Kerosene was the main source of light for millions of Americans, and you can track the price. It dropped from $4 a barrel in 1862 down to 58 cents a gallon, then 26 cents, and eventually down to just 8 cents a gallon.
That is a 98% price decrease.
Exactly. That massive price collapse made light affordable for the working class. Imagine the change. Kids could study after dark. People could read. Folsom argues this price drop was one of the greatest civilizing forces of the era, all brought about by market-driven efficiency.
But the conventional wisdom always comes back to the rebates. That was his unfair predatory advantage.
And Folsom tackles this head-on. He shows Rockefeller got large rebates because he was the largest, most reliable shipper. He guaranteed the railroads 60 carloads of oil every single day.
Volume was everything to the railroad.
Everything. And the railroads testify that they would offer the exact same rebate to any competitor who could match Standard Oil's volume and reliability.
That wasn't a secret deal. It was a volume discount available to anyone.
Precisely. The rebates were a consequence of his efficiency, not the cause of his dominance. His competitors couldn't get them because they weren't efficient enough.
And this cost advantage was critical because the competition wasn't just domestic. Folsom highlights the overlooked Russo-American oil war.
A major gap in the textbooks. 2/3 of American oil was exported. The main threat was from the huge Baku oil fields in Russia, which were geographically much closer to the European and Asian markets.
So if Rockefeller hadn't been hyper-efficient, America would have lost that global market entirely.
No question. Standard Oil's victory was a narrow triumph of efficiency over superior natural advantages. Rockefeller's efficiency secured millions in exports for the U.S. and provided cheap oil worldwide.
And we should just briefly note his one big flirtation with political entrepreneurship.
The South Improvement Company pool in 1872, a scheme to fix prices. Rockefeller joined briefly, but it was quickly shut down by public outcry. He admitted it was a mistake and returned to his core strategy: relentless competition. He never lobbied for tariffs or subsidies again.
All right, shifting into the 1920s, we see this market entrepreneur philosophy move from building things to shaping federal fiscal policy. Our last major figure is Andrew Mellon.
Treasury Secretary under Presidents Harding and Coolidge, a titanic figure, one of the 3 wealthiest men in America.
And he arrived in Washington after World War I, facing a huge national debt and a stagnant economy.
An economy being stifled by incredibly punitive taxes. The top income tax rate was a staggering 77%.
Which is almost confiscatory. And what was the practical effect of a rate that high?
It was perverse. It drove productive, risk-taking capital, the money that funds new factories and creates jobs out of the market. The wealthy, legally trying to avoid that 77% tax, were just parking their money in unproductive, tax-exempt municipal bonds.
So the high tax rate wasn't even generating the revenue the government expected.
Exactly, because the capital is hiding in shelters. So Mellon, applying his market philosophy, came in with this radical idea. He argued that high rates of taxation do not necessarily mean large revenue.
That more revenue might be obtained by lower rates.
Right. His goal was to cut the high taxes to lure that capital back into risky, job-creating enterprises that would actually generate taxable income.
And what were the results of the Mellon plan?
A startling triumph, as Folsom calls it. Mellon successfully cut the top income tax rate from 73% down to 24% by 1929. And what happened to revenue?
It went up.
Personal income tax revenue increased from $719 million in 1921 to over $1 billion in 1929. The lower rates encouraged a taxable economic boom.
And this is a huge area where Folsom's research just directly refutes the textbook narrative. The common critique is that this was spare the rich policy that shifted the tax burden onto the poor, the trickle-down myth.
And Folsom's use of the actual tax data obliterates that myth. In reality, Mellon's policy did the opposite. It shifted the tax burden toward the rich, who are now paying taxes on massive productive investments.
What do their numbers say?
By 1929, the highest earners, the $100,000 plus bracket, were paying 65% of all income taxes collected. The lowest earners paid only 1.3%.
So the rich paid a much higher percentage of the total tax burden under the lower rates.
Far higher. The data shows he succeeded in both generating more revenue and placing the largest tax burden on the highest earners, completely contrary to the historical myth.
So if we zoom out and look at Folsom's entire argument, Vanderbilt, Hill, Rockefeller, Mellon, what's the central moral and constitutional defense of the market entrepreneur?
It really connects back to the founders' original vision, their distrust of special privilege. They envisioned a system where enterprise was free and success depended on serving the public, not on cozying up to political power.
And Folsom shows that the men we call robber barons were often the ones advancing that order by driving down prices and breaking government-backed monopolies.
The lesson is just painfully clear. Political promotion of economic development is inherently futile because it consistently rewards incompetence.
Because when you guarantee a return with a subsidy or a tariff, you remove the incentive to be efficient.
You breed incompetence, which breeds resentment, which leads to calls for more regulation, which then stifles the genuine innovators like Hill who are actually serving the public. The corruption came not from the market, but from the political class picking winners and losers.
So we circle back to where we started. Were these great industrialists villains, or were they the visionaries who built modern America? Folsom's work doesn't say they were angels.
No, it doesn't deny greed or ruthlessness, but it demands we look at the source of the behavior, and the synthesis is clear. The real builders, Vanderbilt, Hill, Rockefeller, Schwab, created immense permanent value for the consumer through relentless competition and cost-cutting.
While the inefficiency, the corruption, the waste...
that was overwhelmingly concentrated in the hands of the political entrepreneurs who used the state to steal competition itself.
And Folsom's thesis is just as relevant today. Every age faces this temptation to replace open markets with political favoritism.
The temptation of crony capitalism is always there. Folsom's work is a reminder that the real robber barons aren't the ones who get rich producing things efficiently. They're the ones who use government to get an advantage over a more efficient rival.
So defending capitalism, in Folsom's view, is really about defending the voluntary cooperation of the marketplace.
And ensuring that success is earned by continuously creating value for other people.
And finally, a provocative thought to leave you with, drawn from the sheer fluidity Folsom found in the market system. In the story of the Scrantons, the success of the founding entrepreneurs, it was hard to transfer to the next generation.
Right. Many of the founders' sons, despite having all this inherited wealth, they lacked the drive. They failed to innovate. They just frittered away the fortunes.
And what does that mean?
It means the market system, when it's free from guaranteed political privilege, ensures that economic leadership is constantly renewed. Newcomers, often immigrants with nothing, see opportunities and rise to the top, replacing the entrenched elite who grew complacent.
That ongoing renewal, where success has to be earned over and over by serving the public better than anyone else.
That is the ultimate safeguard of a free market system.
Well, that's about all the time we have. You've been listening to the deep dive from Wake Up and Smell the Freedom, where ideas percolate. Thanks for joining us as we continue to explore the ideas that shaped liberty and continue to shape us today. Remember, the pursuit of liberty begins with understanding, and understanding begins with asking the right questions. Until next time.
Bye-bye.